Um, and then we get the contrast of Dora's father, and we get that in a list. When I replaced the phone on the receiver, it occurred to me that the television was not on at Dora's house. Her father was lying on the couch, reading a magazine with a glass of wine on the coffee table, and there was saxophone music playing on the stereo. How much more descriptive can you get? Like, I'm so happy that she said it that way instead of, Dora's father was relaxing. And then we get this conclusion of the story part of the story. The timeline that I described that we were on, we're now finally coming to an end. So when she got back home from trick-or-treating, which does also give us a timeline, right? We know that this was the end of September, which was when she felt comfortable enough getting the glass for Mr. Pirzada, and her father said, he's not Indian anymore. That was the end of September. So now it's Halloween. So we know how long this story all took place in October, right? So in the living room, Mr. Pirzada, when she returned home from trick-or-treating, in the living room, Mr. Pirzada, my father, and my mother were sitting side by side on the sofa. The television was turned off, and Mr. Pirzada had his head in his hands. What they heard that evening, and for many evenings after that, was that India and Pakistan were drawing closer and closer to war. Troops from both sides lined the border. Dhaka was insisting on nothing short of independence. The war was to be waged on East Pakistani soil, which is Dhaka. It's Bangladesh. It's where Mr. Pirzada was from. The United States was siding with West Pakistan, the Soviet Union with India, and what was soon to be Bangladesh. And so now not only is this war happening, but Mr. Pirzada is on enemy territory by being in the United States, because the United States was siding with one, and it wasn't his, and his side was being supported by the Soviet Union, which in 1971 was in the Cold War with the United States. So that made Mr. Pirzada's status in the United States kind of dangerous. That's what that implies, at least to me, as I understand that history. War was officially declared on December 4th. And so that, to me, is a time marker. That's saying we're off the conveyor belt. We are no longer in the time. 12 days later, the Pakistani army, weakened by having to fight 3,000 miles from their source of supplies, surrendered in Dhaka. All of these facts I know only now, for they are available to me in any history book in any library. But then it remained, for the most part, a remote mystery with haphazard clues. All of these lists, this entire story, is a remote history with haphazard clues of what was going on in East Pakistan in 1971. I think that could be a subtitle of this entire story: a remote history, a history that is distant geographically from the history it's actually trying to tell. And that geography, that distance, is so important to understanding this story, because you could argue that this story is all about perspective, which is all about place and setting. All these things are in it. Time, too. Because now we also hear that she only knows these things now. And so that is our understanding that Lelia is an adult telling this story from her childhood, rather than Lelia, the child, writing this story as a child. What I remember during those 12 days of the war was that my father no longer asked me to watch the news with them, and that Mr. Pirzada stopped bringing me candy. This is the break of the symbol and of their relationship. and that my mother refused to serve anything other than boiled eggs and rice for dinner. I remember some nights helping my mother spread a sheet and blankets on the couch so that Mr. Pirzada could sleep there, and high-pitched voices hollering in the middle of the night when my parents called our relatives in Calcutta to learn more details about the situation. Most of all, I remember the three of them, and this is really great writing, so just pay attention to this sentence. Most of all, I remember the three of them operating during that time as if they were a single person, sharing a single meal, a single body, a single silence, and a single fear. They are showing a kind of unity in the middle of a bunch of cutting up that's happening elsewhere. And then we get this summary at the end. For a long time, we did not hear anything from him. Our evenings went on as usual with dinners in front of the news. The only difference was that Mr. Pirzada and his extra watch, Mr. Pirzada and his otherness, weren't there. And then finally, this is the last paragraph now. Just like you can learn a lot from the first paragraphs, you can learn a lot from the last paragraphs. Finally, several months later, we received a card from Mr. Pirzada commemorating the Muslim New Year, along with a short letter. He was reunited, he wrote, with his wife and children. All were well, having survived the events of the past year at an estate belonging to his wife's grandparents in the mountains of Shillong. His 7 daughters were a bit taller, he wrote, but otherwise they were the same, and he still could not keep their names in order. Still joking. At the end of the letter, he thanked us for our hospitality, adding that although he now understood the meaning of the words thank you, they were still not adequate to express his gratitude. To celebrate the good news, my mother prepared a special dinner that evening, and when we sat down to eat at the coffee table, we toasted our water glasses, but I did not feel like celebrating. Irony. You know, they're having a celebration, and she's upset. Though I had not seen him in months, it was only then that I felt Mr. Pirzada's absence. It was only then, raising my water glass in his name, that I knew what it meant to miss someone who was so many miles and hours away, just as he had missed his wife and daughters for so many months. He had no reason to turn to us, and my parents predicted correctly that we would never see him again. Since January, each night before bed, I had continued to eat, for the sake of Mr. Pirzada's family, a piece of candy I had saved from Halloween. That night there was no need to. Eventually, I threw them away. And so we know that this symbol is important because it's the last thing we see in the story. And it's her throwing them away. The candies were no longer from Mr. Pirzada. They were the ones that she'd been saving since Halloween and having one night at a time to pray for the family. This is her bond with Mr. Pirzada that was made for the safety of his family. It was this act of generosity that she was paying back to him for his act of generosity to her. And she no longer felt that generosity coming or going or being necessary, so she threw them away. It's the end of the story because it's the end of the symbol. So there's a lot to think about with this story. I hope that walking through it like that was useful for you in understanding this story. I hope that you liked this story. Thank you so much for watching. I hope it wasn't too boring and that we can keep doing these videos for the rest of the semester. I can't wait to read what you write in response to Mr. Pirzada Came to Dine, when Mr. Pirzada Came to Dine, that you can send me in an email in the next week or so by Friday if you'd like.